About SQL. In this nugget, we're going to understand what SQL, or Structured Query Language, is. A little bit about its history, how to pronounce it. I know that that's an often asked question among beginners to database administration. We'll look at the SQL variants by platform. We'll see where Oracle's implementation of SQL stacks up next to, say, Microsoft or IBM's version, or the ANSI ISO SQL standard itself. The remainder of this nugget deals with the inbox first-party tools that you'll be expected to know how to use for your Oracle certification exams, namely the SQL Plus command line environment and the SQL Developer graphical user interface. Remember that, and this is true for any IT certification exam, you'll only be expected to know first-party tools. That is to say, tools that are published directly by Oracle. You won't be asked about anything by any other company, and that's by design. Let's get to work. What is SQL? The best way I find to describe the structured query language is that it's not so much a programming language as it is a data access language. We talked a little bit about, in the previous nugget, the relational model of database design and the fact that Oracle is the premier example and actually one of the earliest examples of a true relational database system. A legend in the field, Dr. E.F. Codd from IBM, published a seminal paper in 1970. That paper is called A Relational Model of Data for Large Shared Databanks, if you're interested in finding it on Google. E.F. Codd is credited with inventing the relational model. And as it happens, the structured query language was developed by a couple colleagues of E.F. Codd's at IBM, Chamberlain and Boyce. The original version of SQL was called Structured English Query Language and was, in point of fact, pronounced SQL. Now, personally, I don't care whether you call SQL SQL or SQL. You'll find some fairly picky database developers and database administrators who feel there's a distinction. In my professional experience, the only time I've found it matters whether we call this SQL or SQL is in terms of the Microsoft SQL Server product. There you'll find, even in Microsoft's own style manuals, that because SQL is part of the SQL Server relational database management system and they have this brand identity, there we're always talking about SQL Server Transact SQL. But other than that, I don't really care at all whether you call it SQL or SQL. Myself, I tend to refer to the language as an initialism, SQL, and some of the utilities we have in Oracle, I'll use SQL. For instance, SQL Plus is going to be our main utility for interacting with Oracle database throughout this course. Another point of possible confusion is the issue of ANSI ISO standardization. SQL standard in general, vendor agnostic, is maintained by the American National Standards Institute and the International Organization for Standardization, ISO. And if you want to, you can head out to those websites and read the official spec documents, which change and evolve like any other specification over time. In my experience, having used a wide variety of relational database management systems, including, of course, Oracle, I found that none is 100% compliant to ANSI ISO SQL, and that's not really the point. ANSI ISO creates a reference standard for the language, and then it's up to each database manufacturer to put their own spin or tweaks on that standard, or on that language, I should say, to suit their needs. So we'll find that Oracle's been around since the 1970s, pretty much since the beginning of the relational model and SQL, the language. So many folks find that Oracle cleaves the closest to ANSI ISO standards, but certainly there's still going to be some slight modifications. Join syntax is one example where the ANSI ISO join syntax is certainly allowed in Oracle, but there's also some Oracle-specific twists that you can add to that syntax. Microsoft, IBM, it's the same way. We'll talk a little bit more about SQL variants in a moment. For now, let's concentrate on the purpose of SQL. Remember, it's not so much a programming language. It's not a procedural language in as such, where you have conditional logic, branching algorithms, error handling. We're certainly going going to work with that a little bit in this course. Oracle's implementation of procedural programming logic is called PLSQL. But strictly speaking, SQL is meant to be a data access language. Remember that in a relational database, we're organizing information in a structured way, and we want that data to be easily and intuitively accessed. This means reads as well as writes. Let's look down at the bottom. We're going to find throughout this course that SQL has four main syntactical variants. We have data definition language statements. These are shortened to DDL statements. DDL, you're actually creating, altering, and dropping objects. A database object would be something like a table or an index, a trigger, a view, a stored procedure. Therefore, you can see right off the bat, the ability to create, alter, and drop those objects can really provide a heavy amount of structural oomph to a database. In other words, if you're granted DDL ability in a database, you have quite a bit of power indeed. DML stands for Data Manipulation Language. DML SQL statements operate on already existing objects, so you can't do DML without some DDL first. The four classic DML statements are select, which is just most of the time, although not exclusively, a read operation where we're pulling rows from one or more tables, insert, where we're adding new information to a table. This is an entirely new row. Update, which is where we make a modification to a row in a table. And delete, which deletes one or more rows from a table. DCL stands for Data Control Language. Remember our working definition of a relational database system. We want to be able to get data in and out of the database tables, and we also want them to be secured against unauthorized access. DCL statements in SQL include statements like grant and revoke. Grant is what we use to, well, you guessed it, grant privileges, system-wide or server privileges, or object-specific privileges like these DDL and DML statements to users. Revoke is exactly the opposite. When we're using DCL statements, we want to use the principle of least privilege. We want to give our users the level of access that they need to our data objects, but certainly no more. I've seen more trouble happen because folks were inadvertently granted too much power in a database than anything else. It's pretty unfortunate. The fourth type of syntactical or variant, purpose variant in SQL are transaction control statements. Key in a relational database management system, pardon the pun, I kind of made a little one there, is the concept of the transaction. A transaction is an atomic unit of work in a database that needs to complete or fail 100% of the way. We want to absolutely avoid intermediate data that's volatile. And commit and rollback are our go-to commands for, in commit's case, making a transaction permanent and making a change that will persist over server restarts in Oracle database. Rollback does just the opposite. It's the equivalent of the undo command if you're familiar with that in Office productivity applications. And SavePoint allows you to have greater control over transactions such that you can write a batch that may include a bunch of statements, put a save point in the middle such that you can roll back to that save point. You don't have to roll back all your work. You can just roll back some of your work. Oracle gives you a fine degree of control over transactions. And we're going to be working with all four of these variants throughout the remainder of this course. As I mentioned in the previous nugget, we have ANSI ISO standards that define structured query language officially, and those are sort of the touch points or the reference points that RDBMS vendors use when they develop their implementation of SQL. So when you're learning a particular database platform, you're always looking at that vendor's flavor or implementation of the structured query language. In most cases, the vendor just calls it SQL. That's the case with Oracle. That's the case with MySQL, which, as you probably know, Oracle owns now. They purchased MySQL from Sun Microsystems. IBM's DB2 relational database system not only uses the just standard plain vanilla SQL to name the structured query language, but you can also run procedural code written in Oracle under DB2. PostgreSQL, there's a whole bunch of different relational database systems out there, and as I said, most of them just call their data access language SQL. One notable exception here is Microsoft. In their SQL Server software, they call their implementation of SQL Transact SQL. And remember what I said earlier about the pronunciation. Microsoft is the lone lone outlier in terms of wanting to call SQL specifically SQL. Now, what's this PLSQL? PLSQL is the procedural extension set to the SQL language. Now, this again is proprietary to Oracle, and this gives Oracle, should I say it gives Oracle developers, the ability to add some of those programming extensions to what is ordinarily just a plain old data access language. So we can write stored procedures, we can write functions, we can write triggers, and really increase the power of our data access in Oracle. Now, you can do a lot of procedural logic in other vendors' products. Transact SQL not only has procedural logic capability baked into it, but you can tap into the very powerful .NET framework and get to those classes. MySQL, DB2, the list goes on. So the idea of procedural extensions to SQL is certainly not something that Oracle has the market cornered on. Now, if you're thinking to yourself, oh brother, if I'm going to market myself as a general purpose, jack of all trades database developer or database administrator, am I going to have to learn the ins and outs of all of these implementations? That'll take me forever. The good news is, I found in my experience, the vast majority, I mean way over 50%, I would even put it over 80% of SQL is going to be identical across all platforms. When you're learning a new platform, maybe you're currently a SQL Server DBA and you're learning Oracle, or maybe you're an Oracle DBA and you need to learn DB2. It's just a question of ferreting out the delta, the proprietary extensions that vendor has added to the language. Once you have the fundamentals down, in other words, you're pretty much all set. Now that I have you hopefully excited about wanting to know more about SQL and how to actually use the language, let me introduce SQL Plus. Some folks call this SQL Plus, other folks call it SQL Star Plus. I think the best I can find, and believe it or not, I'm so much of a nerd, I've researched this. This utility is called SQL Plus. This asterisk or star, as we'll learn shortly, is a shorthand notation that we can use in our select statements to return all rows and all columns, but in this case I think it's just serving as a delimiter. So we call this utility SQL Plus, and officially it's an interactive or batch command line interface for Oracle Database. And you said it, it is in fact a command line interface. There's not a graphical version. In Oracle 9i database, a couple versions back, there was a Windows utility that ran in an actual GUI window, but fortunately Oracle got rid of that, and now no matter which operating system on which Oracle is installed, everybody gets SQL Plus. That really works out well for us for a couple of reasons. Number one, in the real world, especially if you're working as an Oracle consultant, you can rest assured that no matter which site you're visiting, no matter who you're working with, as long as they have Oracle Database installed, they're going to have SQL Plus, so you'll have a familiar environment. By contrast, if you get used to using, say, a third-party management tool like Toad, and then you wind up at a remote site that has only SQL Plus, you might be in a world of hurt. So consistency works well here. The second reason why SQL Plus is dynamite is that it really forces you to learn the language, and you're going to need that language and those language skills in order to pass not only the SQL Fundamentals 1 test, but also your DB1 and DB2 tests as well. Now, where does SQL Plus come from? Is it a free download? Does it cost money? What's the deal? Well, it happens, as I just said, it will always come with the Oracle Database software. That is inescapable. As far as remote access to Oracle Database through SQL Plus, one way to do that is to download the Oracle 11g client libraries. You can install those on your administrative workstation, and you'll be able to fire up SQL Plus from a remote computer and make a remote connection to Oracle Server. At its most basic level, we can look at SQL Plus as simply a vehicle for sending and receiving SQL statements to and from a target Oracle server. There's 4 types of commands that SQL Plus supports. There's an internal command library, and I'm going to show you all this in an upcoming demo, so I'm just giving you the theory right now. In other words, we can access an online help system, we can define system variables, the connection syntax is specific not to SQL but to SQL Plus. One notable difference in SQL Plus between the SQL Plus command set and the standard SQL commands is that the SQL Plus commands are not not stored in the buffer. And I've found, and I'm sure you will too, that the memory buffer that's used in SQL Plus is extremely helpful. That will become very evident to you shortly. Obviously, we can send and receive the full range of supported SQL commands in SQL Plus. We as well can work with programmatic logic and create PLSQL blocks, code blocks, interactively or running them as a script from SQL Plus. Let me mention this. This bears a little bit more explanation. When I said that SQL Plus is an interactive and batch command line interface, what that means is you can log into the SQL Plus environment and you're actually in that environment and you're able to issue, as I said, SQL Plus internal commands, SQL statements, and create PLSQL blocks. You can also, from an operating system prompt, call SQL Plus, the executable, and run SQL script files as a batch. That is to say, if you really want to automate this, you can, through PowerShell or Unix, Linux shell scripting, VBScript, whatever your favorite scripting environment is, Python perhaps, you can call SQL Plus and then run scripts from your utility programs, you see. Therefore, SQL Plus is really a workhorse / jack of all trades with regard to interacting with Oracle Server. Finally, we have something called Oracle Enterprise Manager. OEM, as it's sometimes called, is a website. It's a low footprint website that's an option when you install Oracle Database. I would suggest you install it, that gives you access to a lot, I would say the vast majority of your DBA tasks can be completed from that graphical environment, and there is in fact an SQL worksheet where you can interactively send and receive, as I said, SQL statements from the server. Remember what I said earlier, it's a truism for IT certification, not only of Oracle but any vendor, that you can reasonably expect to be tested only on first-party tools. Of course, a first-party tool is a tool that's been developed by the vendor itself. So in this case, we're concerned in this course only with Oracle tools. We're going to be working both with SQL Plus as well as the graphical Oracle SQL Developer tool. The reason why I want to show you and use SQL Developer a lot in this course, quite honestly, is because it formats output for you in a much more eye-friendly way than does SQL Plus. There are some things that we can only do from SQL Plus, at least only do reasonably well, and I will do that then. But I'm going to focus a lot on SQL Developer here because as a learning tool, it really can't be beat. And frankly, even in a production environment, you get a lot of value in my experience from this tool. It's really an integrated development environment, or IDE. You can do pretty much anything under the sun through this interface. And I'll show it to you in the demo. And as I said, by the end of this course, you will be very proficient in using both SQL Plus and SQL Developer. SQL Developer is an extra download. You would download this from the Oracle website. It's free, and it requires the Java Development Kit, or JDK. So the principle or the workflow is you visit java.com, you download the JDK, get that installed, and then install SQL Developer. I've found in my experience it's about 100 times easier to install this on Windows than it is Nix. That has just been my experience. But once it's installed, it works quite beautifully. I found, frankly, that most Java applications aren't the fastest. It's a little bit clunky in the speed department, but this is greatly outweighed in my experience with its power. Even though we're not going to be focusing on or will be tested on third-party utilities, there is a large market actually for folks who develop integrated development environments for Oracle and will charge you money. And of course, you're going to get some Cadillac or premium features. Toad for Oracle is a standout product. Navicat is another one. Forgive my poor spelling here. And for your home environment, this might work fine, but you always want to be careful of two things. One, there may come a time where you're doing Oracle troubleshooting and all you have are the base tools, most notably SQL Plus. And number two, over-reliance upon graphical tools may lead to you being a little lazy in terms of understanding the underlying SQL. And that takes me back to my first point. If you're in a troubleshooting spot where you only have a command line environment, you may be in some very hot and deep waters indeed. In this demo, I'm going to show you a little bit about SQL Plus and SQL Developer. We're going to get our sea legs with these utilities here. You're looking at the desktop of an Ubuntu Linux machine that I've named LinNugget, and upon which I've installed Oracle Database 11g Release 2. Officially, I need you to understand that, and this is much to the consternation of many fellow Ubuntu fans like myself, Oracle, for whatever reason, still has not certified their database product on Ubuntu. If you're looking for a certified distribution of Linux, you'll want to do Oracle Linux, which is essentially Oracle's implementation of Red Hat Enterprise Linux. You can go RHEL if you will, if you want to as well. Believe me, it took quite a bit of time and elbow grease to get Oracle running under Ubuntu. It's not an exercise for the faint at heart. Regardless, let's open up a terminal prompt and I'll show you how to use SQL+. As long as you've installed Oracle successfully and you have your path environment variable set properly, then you can initiate the SQL+ executable from anywhere in your operating system environment. One more thing about operating systems, everything we're going to learn in this course, although I'm using a Linux machine in this training, ports perfectly well to Mac OS X, which as you probably know relies upon Unix underneath the candy-coated shell, as well as Microsoft Windows environment. So don't think you're losing anything just because I'm on Linux here. Anyway, we can run SQL+ with no other argument and we're prompted to enter a username. This is going to be either an Oracle user account that was created within Oracle database, or it could be an operating system account that's a member of the local DBA group. For this training, I'm going to use the built-in standard Oracle user HR, which I've enabled and unlocked. It's a built-in account that owns the HR schema objects. We're going to learn more about the HR database and what schemas are and all that in the next nugget. But for now, I'm just going to type the username and then provide the password. Now you notice that as I typed, Oracle masked the password for security reasons. There are other ways to start SQL+ where you can provide your username and password right on the command line, but that's not a recommended way to go. You know you're connected when you see number 1, connected to, and then it gives us the full version of Oracle to which we're connected, and then we have the SQL prompt. We can run the SQL+ statement show user, and that will echo back the currently logged on user. That can be helpful if you're doing development and you're constantly logging on and logging off as different users. To exit SQL+, you can type exit, and that will take you back to your operating system prompt. Another way to start SQL+ is to type the word SQL+ space and then the name of the user account that you want to log in as, HR. Again, we're asked for the password and we're in. Let me exit once again. You can also use what's called Easy Connect syntax, and here we're providing a full connection string, including the password on the command line. Obviously, this is something you don't want to do as a general rule, because if someone is shoulder surfing, they're going to see your password, and also, especially vulnerable in Linux Unix environments, any parameters that we pass to an executable are able to be seen when we run the PS command. For instance, let me run SQL+, and I'm going to type HR/ my password, which in this case is really weak. It's literally the word password, @ and then the name of the database to which we're connected. The idea of how to set up what's called a service name, or a database name, or an instance name, sometimes those terms all get mushed together, is beyond the scope of this training. For anything that you're wondering what I'm doing that's not related to specific SQL commands, you can pretty much rest assured that we cover those technical topics in my CBT Nuggets course covering 1Z0052, Database Administration 1. So in this case, we're providing a full connection string, username and password, @ and then the name of the database to which we want to connect. And that's nice in as much as we didn't have to stop and wait and interactively get prompted for credentials. It took us right in. But of course, there's the problem of the password appearing on the command line as previously discussed. Okay, if you are an administrator, that is to say you belong to an operating system group called DBA, let me show you that really quickly. If you look in the upper right, I'm logged on to this machine as a user named Oracle. And if I open up my users and groups control panel in Ubuntu, we can manage groups, and we'll find a group called DBA, and we'll see Oracle belongs to that group. Now in Windows, when you install Oracle, a lot of this stuff is automated for you. When you're doing Oracle database installation on Linux, you have to create these user accounts, you have to create these groups. Bottom line is, any account that's a member of the DBA operating system group on your Oracle server has the ability to invoke sysdba privilege, in other words, be a complete super user on that system. Let me clear the screen and show you how that syntax works. We would type SQL+ / as sysdba. So what this is telling Oracle is that we're logging on, or we want to be authenticated, should I say, using our operating system account. In this case, it's Oracle. And then as sysdba says, we don't just want to come in as a DBA, we want to invoke our super user privileges. Therefore, we would use this connection string only for when we had DBA level tasks to do in Oracle. A nice thing about using the operating system authentication is that we're not prompted for a password. It's actually a pass-through mechanism whereby Oracle assumes that because we're a valid user on the local operating system, we don't have to authenticate the user, we can just let that user in. You see what I mean? Alright, exit one more time. The final way I want to show you to get into SQL+, I know there's lots of different ways, aren't there? You can actually log into SQL+ without logging in as a user. So maybe I shouldn't use the term log into SQL+. We're starting SQL+ without authenticating as an Oracle user, and that's typing SQL+ with the no log switch. This takes you into the SQL prompt where you can do certain administrative tasks, but because we're not connected to a database, we're not going to be able to run queries against that database. For instance, if I run select star from user objects, trying to pull data from a data dictionary view, it tells us SP20640 not connected. So to that end, we can use the connect statement to connect as any user, and now we're in. You see how that works? Now, officially, it's best practice to, if I want to connect now as another user, like maybe sys, the default super user in Oracle, I should disconnect and then reconnect as that separate account. But it's not, strictly speaking, required to do that. Let me try that again. It tells us connect as sys should be as sysdba or sysopper. So I'll just say connect sys as sysdba, put in my password, and now I'm connected. Now what I was saying in that word salad over the last minute, sorry about that, is that while it's best practice to formally disconnect before reconnecting, watch this. I can just issue a connect HR, put in the password, and I'm connected. The reason why I like to stress the strict way to go about things, in other words, being really explicit with our connects and disconnects, is because we want to be careful about committing our changes. When we do a formal disconnect, Oracle will implicitly commit any active transactions that we have in memory. So if you just start taking shortcuts here like I did most recently, you run the risk, albeit a low risk, of uncommitted transactions remaining as such and getting unexpected results in your database. Thus far, we've seen a couple SQL+ specific commands, namely connect and disconnect. Let me walk you through the help system such as it is. If you type the word help with no other arguments, it tells us we should type help index or question mark index to see a specific list of topics. You can also check out the documentation. These are actually live hyperlinks. You notice as I'm hovering over them, I can click these if I want to. We'll be talking about sources of Oracle documentation later in the course. In my experience, Oracle has some of the best documentation of any enterprise software system I've ever seen. For now though, let's type help index, and what this is going to give us is a run of not SQL commands, but remember SQL plus internal commands. Over the course of this training, we'll probably master, say, half of these, at least the most important ones. To look at help for one of these topics, it tells us what to do. Enter help topic for help. So if we, for instance, want to understand everything there is to know about the connect SQL+ statement, we can type help connect, press enter, and we get not a lot of documentation back, but at least we get a brief description of what the command is, its full syntax, and then a little bit more supplemental information. Not quite as nice as a man page. You'll certainly get a lot more bang for your buck by hitting the documentation online, but it's better than nothing. Another command that we'll be using a lot is the host command. The host command enables you to ping-pong in between the SQL+ prompt and the host operating system prompt. So for instance, if I wanted to duck out of SQL, keep my connection, I'm logged in as, you remember show user, I'm logged in as HR. If I type host, after a moment's pause, we are now in the Oracle @LinNugget operating system prompt. And I can do whatever I want here. I can check my present working directory, I can run directory listings, whatever it is. And once I'm finished, maybe I have a file to copy, a SQL script file to go from one location to another. To come back to my SQL session, and this takes a little bit of getting used to think think of it this way. You type exit because we are first going from SQL to the host environment, and then to come back to SQL, we're exiting out of the host environment and coming back into the SQL prompt. We can also run the host command in a batch format. Maybe that's not the correct word, but for instance, we can run host space and then some OS command. One that I'll use a lot throughout this training when I want to clear the screen from within the SQL session is host clear. That means we're just executing a single host OS command, and there you go. Next, let's take a look at the buffer. The buffer is a space in memory that SQL Plus gives us for the last SQL command that we issued. It's not like the old Windows, how you can just use up arrow, up arrow, up arrow, or even for that matter, the Linux terminal environment where you can recall the last X number of commands. The SQL Plus buffer has space for only the last SQL statement you had in that buffer, and you can access the contents of your buffer by using the list command. So we can type list, and looks like my last statement that I issued was that select star from user objects. You'll remember that a little bit earlier. Let me write another quick query here. I'll say select department ID, department name from departments. Now, don't worry about the fact we haven't covered the select statement. We don't know what departments is. I'll just tell you it's a table within the HR schema. More will be revealed as we go on. Just take things at face value for now. I do want you to see here that I did in fact press enter between these lines. So I typed select department ID, comma, enter, and notice that we get line numbers. It isn't until we use the all-important semicolon as our statement terminator that Oracle will actually run the command. That is to say, now that I've used the semicolon, if I hit enter, Oracle executes the query and we get the results of that query. You see what I mean? Now, let me do a host clear, and if I use list or even L, we can see the contents of our buffer. And this, what I'm about to tell you now, is a really, really big time-saving trick. It's possible to do line editing. Let's say we had a really long honkin' query that we had written here in SQL Plus, and we made a typo somewhere in the middle, let's say on line 2 here. How can we go back to line 2 and make changes to rerun the query? Well, it's certainly possible to do that, but I'm going to bypass the line editing controls because they're so clunky, and instead show you how to edit using an actual honest-to-goodness text editor. What you do is first we can run the define statement to look at our session level variables. The variable we're interested in is called editor, underscore editor actually. And this variable is going to be different by default based on your host OS. On my LinNugget machine, it's defaulting to the archaic ed editor. On Windows, Notepad is the reasonable choice, and that will be set for you by default. I don't like ed, I like gedit. So if I want to just do a define underscore editor equals gedit with double quotes, I now have the ability to list my query on screen, or check this out, if I type edit, gedit, my editor will pop up, and now I have full GUI goodness to change this however I want to. Let's say I just want to see select department ID from departments. See, you can make your change. When you use this, what happens is a file gets written to your home folder called afi.edt.buf. It is a file in the file system, and as such, you need to save your changes when you make changes to your buffer file. We do not want to put a semicolon in the file. Instead, you'll note line 3 has a forward slash. The forward slash is the equivalent of the go button. It's another way, besides the semicolon, that we can instruct Oracle to run a query. So again, I've saved my changes in the buffer, come back, and now to run, I can do forward slash, and there it is. It runs the query again. You see what I mean? So we'll be using list and edit a lot throughout this training, especially for more complex queries. The final bit I want to show you here with SQL Plus before we move over to SQL Developer is the column command. It gives us column formatting ability. Now you're wondering, what the heck do I mean here? Well, why don't I type edit again, EDIT. I like to craft queries from within here as well. And we're going to select employee ID, first name, last name, email, phone number from employees. It's a lot of columns, isn't it? Let's save our changes. And what do we get? This is a very common issue that newcomers to Oracle just pull the hair out of their heads on. Depending upon how your terminal environment is set up, it may not display all of your rows and columns in an attractive way. Look at this, how homely this is. We have the columns, employee ID, first name, last name, email, phone number, but they're all messed up. We can make changes to the column widths by using a SQL Plus statement called column. And what you do here is you provide column, the name of the column that you want to adjust the width for, format, and then A, and then the number of characters width you want for that column. So I'm going to do an A12. And that's a session level change. /, things are getting better now, aren't they? We've shrunk up the size of the last name column. Well, let's do it again. Column, let's adjust email this time. Format A10 characters, /, and that's looking better, isn't it? That's definitely a report that we could be happy printing. However, check out what's going on here. Notice that the column headings keep reoccurring every dozen or so rows. What's up with that? This is the default pagination that's used in SQL+, and it may not be something you need or want. It might be an annoyance, whatever. You can adjust the page size as well. I'm going to set page size to 0 that effectively turns it off. So if I run the query again, now I get everything back in just a single row. You see what I mean? It's up to you on how you want to set that. If you want to clear out the column formatting, they'll be cleared once we disconnect and reconnect. But in this session, if we want to clear the columns, we can just run clear columns, and now it tells us columns cleared. If we /, we're back to what we were before. So I hope you thought that was helpful. That was a brief introduction to SQL+. As I said, we're going to be using it a lot throughout this training, but we're also going to concentrate more so on SQL Developer as our tool for two reasons. One, because it's made by Oracle and it's therefore a first-party utility, and number two, it gives us better looking output, so it's a nice learning tool for us. Here we are on the Oracle Technology Network. This is the page for downloading Oracle SQL Developer. Version 3 is current as of this recording in June 2011. And in order to find this page, what I did is just ran a simple Google query for download SQL Developer. And you'll notice all it is accepting the license agreement and then downloading the appropriate version. Windows is kind of cool because they'll give you a copy that includes the JDK. Otherwise, for us Linux people or Mac OS, they do not include the JDK. For Linux, our options are a general purpose package or an RPM. RPM, remember, harkens back to the fact that Red Hat Enterprise Linux is the official certified platform for Oracle Database. Assuming you've downloaded and installed the product, okay, it's just a question of starting it from your OS environment. Let me exit out of SQL+ and just type SQL Developer to fire up the application. Remember, as a Java application, it's not the fastest tool, but I think you'll agree with me that it's an excellent learning tool and even practical DBA tool as well. Alright, when we first start the tool, you're given a tip of the day. That's been a long-standing feature of Windows applications. I'm going to deselect Show Tips at Startup and we'll close this out. We'll also maximize the window. The start page is pretty cool because it gives us some nice useful hyperlinks that you definitely want to check out. Links to tutorials, demonstrations, the Oracle user manuals for SQL Developer, etc. Also in the upper right, notice the search box. This is cool. As long as your machine is connected to the internet, you can search Oracle documentation, the Oracle Technology Network forums, including the Ask Tom site. Tom Kite is an Oracle employee and guru who runs an excellent question-answer exchange, and it's nice to be able to query that directly from SQL Developer. This tool should look kind of familiar to you in its general flow. For those of you coming from Microsoft SQL Server, this looks quite a bit like SQL Server Management Studio. I think you'd agree with me. You'll notice the left pane has a connections area and a reports area. We're going to focus on connections here. You'll want to create stored connections for, of course, your account, maybe the sys account if you are the DBA for your organization. Quickly show you how to do that. You can right-click the connections node and select New Connection. And we just fill out the form here. I'm going to create a connection for HR. I'll call the connection HR. The username is HR. I'm going to put in my password and save it so we don't have to keep putting it in. I'm going to use the basic network settings. HR is an ordinary user, so we don't have the ability to come in as sysdba. Localhost, port 1521 work fine because we are in fact on the Oracle server. SID or service ID is the name of the database. XE is what gets put in there by default. That's the default SID for Oracle Personal Edition, but as we've already saw, the name of my SID is ORCL. It's definitely handy to test things out, so So I clicked test, told me status is success. So let's click connect and come in as an HR user. There we are. So we have a query builder. Let me type a little bit. The font is a little bit small there. So let's go to Tools, Preferences. There are a lot of preferences that you can set here. For font, why don't I, under Code Editor, why don't I bring this up to, let's try 16 and see if 16 is good. That's okay. Let's come back to Preferences again. Another option that I think is useful, especially for our purposes in education, is to show line numbers from the line gutter area. And it just goes on and on. There's a lot we can do here that's pretty cool. You can enter any SQL Plus or SQL command in here. It behaves exactly like SQL Plus does in that regard. To run a selected batch or single statement, we can use this first button here. That's the run command. Control Enter is what we use to do that. And remember I mentioned that the output is a lot prettier here than it is with SQL Plus. Let me add in the query that we worked with earlier, like so. And note that I don't have to select this. I've seen some newcomers to Oracle working in Developer going like this, selecting the whole batch and then clicking run. That's not necessary at all. You can actually place the cursor in any line in this statement and the query will run fine. Do you know why? Well, of course, that's because the statement terminator is what dictates where queries start and end. And remember I told you the Outlook. Look at how nice that Outlook looks compared to what SQL Plus gave us. Isn't that great? The final thing I want to show you in this demonstration is how to run a script file. Remember I mentioned that SQL Plus is both an interactive tool as well as a scriptable utility. Let me write out a quick DDL statement to create a simple table. There we go. So instead of running this DDL, I can save this out. Let me click save. I'm going to save it in my home directory and I'll call it testtable.sql. The default extension is going to be SQL anyway. This is going to be a SQL script. And now that I have that script created, let me come back to SQL Plus. I'll spawn a new tab and we'll log in as my DBA user. To run a script from within SQL Plus is as easy as using the start command or even better the notation of the @ sign. Now to figure out where our present working directory is, although we are in SQL Plus, we are at the same time in the host environment in a present working directory, aren't we? So why don't we do a host pwd to verify that we are in there. Moreover, I'll do a host ls star.sql to verify that test table's in there. I'm going to use @testtable.sql. And it would help, I suppose, if I had the syntax in that script file correct. Told us that we were missing a parentheses. Oh yeah, see the problem? Well, I wouldn't expect you to see the problem because we haven't covered DDL syntax, but the bottom line is the create table statement needs to be enclosed on the outside with parentheses, and I was missing that, wasn't I? So let me save my changes, come back to SQL Plus, and let's try that again one more time with feeling. @testtable.sql. Table created. So we should be able to do a select star from test table, but we're not going to get anything back. We could actually run a describe on test table, just again to verify that the object exists. So to invoke a script file from an OS prompt, we can type SQL Plus username/password space @ and then the name of the script file. And there you have it. About SQL review. I'm confident at this point that you'd be able to intelligently define and discuss SQL if someone were to ask you, say, in a stress job interview prior to your hire. You also now understand the major variants in SQL. You understand the ANSI ISO roots of the language, as well as just the basics of different vendors' implementations. I also gave you a nice introduction to the two main tools we'll be using throughout the rest of this course, the SQL Plus command line environment, as well as the really nice SQL Developer graphical tool. I hope that this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.